All right. So first we have to start with some basic ground rules about this witchcraft stuff. One, Puritans didn't understand witches to be like, if you could see my hat, like women who ran around with purple or black hats and rode on brooms. Okay, that's a much later thing. There's some of that stuff. Actually, some of that stuff's older and European. Some of it's later, but it's not that. They understood witches to be minions of Satan, right? Bitches who hung with Satan, and some dudes, as we'll see. But then here's the thing we have to agree to. Just hold on with me. I'm not treating you like you're stupid, but we have to agree to this. Can we agree that for the purposes of this lecture, witches do not exist? Okay, I'm not saying that pagans don't exist, that Wiccans don't exist, that history professors with purple hats don't exist, but rather that real live witches who can do magic and sign pacts with Satan do not exist. Okay? Good. All right. Having agreed that, we need to keep in mind for the rest of the lecture that what we're talking about here is women and some men being accused of something they were not. Ergo, we know right up front, something else was going on there. Okay? Yeah, we got that. But we can also, we're getting this? Look at, there it is. And if you think, well, that's just stupid. Why would anybody want to do that? Well, I don't know why anybody would dance naked in the woods. I guess because it's fun. Well, probably they didn't. Why did Puritans think that witches went out in the woods and danced naked? Well, because it's a fundamental challenge to male authority, right? Women out at night, unsupervised by men, dancing around naked. That's as engaging in a sort of free-form sexuality, again, without the supervision of male authority. That is, so that you get some cases of accusations that the witch possessed me. They believe that witches like to possess two groups of women, young girls, not two groups of women, two groups of people. The first group would be young women. They thought that a witch, if you were a young woman, say 14 to 24 is the usual age range, and you wanted to say that a witch possessed you, what would you have done? How would we know? Well, if any of you had ever been possessed by a witch, under the witch's possession, you would be a bad girl. You would say and do naughty things. And then later on you'd be like, it wasn't my fault. I didn't ask Johnny to look at my special pink parts because I'm a bad girl. I asked Johnny to look at my special pink parts because I was possessed by a witch. It's not my fault. Okay? So, yeah, we got that. Also, witches sometimes, or the Puritans thought they did, because remember, none of this is real. Thought that witches would occasionally possess adult men. And witches, they thought, did two things to adult men. First, they would hag ride them. That is, hag being a synonym for witch. That is, that a witch would possess a man, and when you were being possessed by a witch, guys, you wouldn't know it, because she would have possessed your mind and your body, so you wouldn't remember it the next morning. So how would you know that a witch had taken you out and ridden you around the village like a pony? That is, hag-ridden you. Well, you ever wake up and your knees hurt and your shoulders hurt or your back hurt and you're like, man, I've been laying in bed and I feel crummy and everything hurts. Well, the only explanation is that you were possessed by a witch and she took you out and she rode you around like a pony. Yeah, sure. Okay. Also, they thought witches like to possess adult men and, brace yourself, no, force men to have sex against their will. Oh, don't you hate it when that happens? So we can joke, but essentially forcing people to have sex against their will is rape, and it's not funny, right? Okay. But there was a notion that adult witches, would sneak into men's rooms, possess their minds and bodies, so you wouldn't know the next day that you'd been forced to have sex against the will. So how would you know? How would you know? How could you say, she did this to me when you'd been possessed, and you theoretically didn't have a memory? Well, and I don't know, let's see if any of the guys know about this. You ever wake up at night and you've had, I don't know, like sexy dreams, and there's a, nocturnal emission there in the bed, and you're like, wait, where did that come from? Well, probably a witch possessed you and had sex with you. There's no other explanation. Okay? So, and if you're thinking, well, those are all stupid, there were ways for the culture to explain a bunch of things. For young women, the notion was that young women who made these accusations, it was a way for young women to attack older women, and we'll talk about that later, about why young women would want to do that. For men, it was a way to talk about dangerous female sexuality and to literally demonize women with their own hidden and maybe not that hidden sexual desires. Yeah? Yeah. And I do not want you to write these charts down. I do not want you to memorize these charts. What I want you to do, each chart will have a checklist, a thing, a punchline, a thing we need to learn from that. So this chart, for example, we're going to learn a few things from this chart. And one of the things we're going to learn is that most witches were women. I'm trying to get my pen to work without me stopping the recording clock. Hold on while I see if I can do that. Pen. Witches. Nope, didn't work. Okay. I don't know. It's not working. So anyway, you're going to have to just trust me. So we see from this chart that historically most witches were women. Oh, and by the way, if you're wondering, I didn't come up with these charts. They're from a book by a woman named Carol Carlson called Devil in the Shape of a Woman. And Carol Carlson in the 80s is the very first American historian to examine witchcraft with an eye to gender. That is, she's the very first historian to say, what about witches is about women? No one else had done that. There were all these theories. Maybe it was about where people lived. Maybe it was about people's social and class location. Nobody had said, why are most of the accused women? And what we find out from this chart is that most of the people accused of witchcraft were indeed women. It literally won't let me use the pen anymore, so I don't know what to say. But if you'll see in that top corner, oh, by the way, over there you'll see accused, tried, convicted, and executed. I call that the hierarchy of seriousness. So accused, oh no, you're a witch. Tried, you went on trial for being a witch. Convicted, you were found guilty of being a witch. And executed, oh no, you're dead. And what we see there is that most of the people who were accused, tried, convicted, and executed for witchcraft are women. Okay, you're thinking, I didn't need a chart for that, Peg. I'm not stupid. But the reality is we get a lot of stuff about American history wrong. So we never ever want to think we know the answer. We always want to check. So here we've checked. So if you were taking notes, I think the first thing we're going to make a list now. And the first thing we put on our list is most witches were women. Keeping in mind that these people weren't really witches, right? So most accused witches were women. But also notice over there under the male category, that column, that we do have 75 accused male witches, 13 tried, and 7 convicted, and 7 executed. So the second thing you can write there is some witches were women. Okay. No, some witches were men. Most witches were women, thing 1. Thing 2, some witches were men. Okay, good. There's a couple things, and we're not going to spend this much time on any other chart, but this one. See that under females, it says we have 45 convicted witchcraft, so 45 times the church elders, who would be the guys running the trials, said, that woman's a witch. She has allied with Satan. She has done these bad things. But then they only executed 28 of them, which means they suffered 13 witches to live. Oh, and by the way, a note about the numbers. These aren't all of the witches that were ever, or all the women who were ever accused. These are all the records that Carol Carlson could find, because this stuff happened 400 years ago and records disappear. So we know that the numbers were larger than this, but this is what she could find going through the archives and counting up. Okay? Okay. So we have some witches convicted of witchcraft, but they're not executed. That's interesting, and if we were in class, I'd say, why do you think that is? And you'd make a number of guesses, and I would say no, 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 until somebody got it right. The right answer is that they would sometimes let a woman say, I'm really sorry for being a witch, and I'll never do it again. And they would not execute her. And then they just make her live in the community as kind of a pariah, a woman who admitted to being a witch. And she becomes kind of a signal lesson about what happens if you go bad. So 13 of these women they decided to let live by, and then the question is which 13? Why? And we're going to get to that. And indeed, if you did the reading, you probably kind of already know. On the other hand, if you go over to the man column, you'll notice we have 7 convicted men and 7 executed men. So I would ask you in class, why do you think they let about a third of the convicted women live, but none of the convicted men? And the answer would be this, and you can probably guess it. So if you want to take a second, pause it and think about it, and then see if you're right. Okay, here's the answer. The answer is that Puritans assumed that even in witchcraft, you might think, well, God, that's too bad they believe in witchcraft, but at least they believed that women could have power. Turns out not so much. It turns out that they figured any place where there was a large number of witches, there was probably a man-witch in charge. A man-witch! Ha ha ha! That is, that even female witches had male bosses. And so the notion was that these male witches were the leaders and thus really, really needed to be executed. Also, in a world of patriarchy and coverture, while that all sounds really good for the dudes, the bad news is, and the guys listening to this lecture can tell you this, is that patriarchy is burdensome to men. It creates this high standard of behavior for men and a high punishment level for men who fail to be sufficiently manly. So the notion was that, yeah, women are subhuman, inferior, possessions, non-human creatures, and yeah, you expect them to hang out with Satan and dance naked in the woods and be sexually naughty and etc., because they're animals. But men are the real humans, and the men should have known better. So there's 2 things there with the men. 1, this notion that they were leaders, and 2, that the crime for a man was larger because men should have known better. So if we were making our list, first, most witches were women. Second, we have some man witches. 3, sometimes women were allowed to say, I'm super sorry, and not be executed. We don't know why yet. 4, so the guys don't feel left out, the man witches. And what we find out about man witches, if we ask what kind of guys were most likely to be accused and executed for witchcraft, what we see here is that while we have the largest accused numbers under dudes under 40, right, 18 there, and then 12 and 4 for in the 40s and 50s, and 4 for over 60. When you get down to the executed, there's a 0 for under 40, and the only executed dudes are under the 40 to 59 and over 60, which tells us that executed man witches tended to be old dudes. And then I would ask you, why do you think they were more likely to find old dudes guilty of being witches and execute them? And the answer would be this. It's really, you want to say it's because old men are more powerful and thus more dangerous, but it turns out that's not the answer. The Puritan society, 90% of these people are farmers. This is gut-wrenching physical work in a world with no Social Security, no 401ks, no retirement. Old people are a burden on the community. So old men are vulnerable because the society doesn't need them as much. And so they're far more likely to be accused and executed as witches, which is really pretty freaking depressing. It turns out that early America was a bad place to grow old, and we'll talk about that again when we look at the witchcraft video and then the handout, not the witchcraft, the midwife video and the handout that goes with that in a couple of weeks, right? Okay, next slide. So what's the deal with the accusers? First, we'll look at people who made accusations of possession. And what we find out is that the people who made accusations of possession were far more, people who made accusations of possession were most likely to be dudes. Most likely to be women. I'm sorry. As soon as I said dudes, I was like, what? No, they were most likely to be women, and they were far more likely, look, where single and women comes together, see the 42? They were most likely to be single women which is another way of saying young women. And this makes sense. Young women would be more likely to say, I was possessed by a witch. That woman's a witch. She possessed me. While the Puritans believed that witches possessed men, we don't have very big numbers in the man column. And it's probably this. And again, the guys, and if we were in the room, the guys could tell you, if you're a dude, the last thing you want to do is go before your homies, your posse, your bros, and worse, the community authorities and say, yeah, some witch made me her bitch, right? So even if you believed you'd been possessed by a witch, men were less likely to make that accusation in open court than young women. Young women could say I'd been possessed because young women didn't have any power to start with. Okay? Now, I actually think that's part of what makes the witchcraft stuff interesting. Here we have young women accusing other women of witchcraft. So this isn't just a matter of men doing bad things to women. This is a matter of women helping men do bad things to women. And that's interesting to me. And it should be interesting to you because it complicates how we think about oppression. All right. So the thing we want to take away from this slide is that the accusers who made claims of possession were most likely young women. Young women made accusations of possession. They're non-possession. So what are the big numbers there? Where are they? Look for them. Do you see them? Yeah, married men. Okay, so married men were more likely to make non-possessed accusations. So, right, she ruined my crop, she ruined my cows. Indeed, remember I told you that is by far the most common accusation. Hold on, I think my husband's home. I'll be right back. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. Not that you had any time thing, but when my husband comes home, all the dogs bark, and there's 4 dogs, and that's a lot of barking. And then, you gotta say, hi, nice to see you. Anyway, etc., etc. So, where were we? Non-possessed accusers. So, okay, again, big numbers there at married men, okay? So, and again, makes sense. Men own the property. Men would make the act. It's whether or not women and men both worked farms, the farm legally belonged to men. Men were more likely to make accusations of possession. And that makes sense. All right. So the thing we're going to write down there is that they're most likely accusers of non-possession stuff were married men. Now, let's stop for a second and think about this. If we think about what we know about Puritans and coverture and patriarchy and the position of men and women, we could have guessed that in terms of power, married men were fairly high on the power. If we thought of power as a thermometer, right, with high, middle, low, we'd imagine that married men were kind of high up. I could wave my arms in the air right now, but you can't see me. So there's that. But if we go back to the previous slide, which I don't want to do, but if we did, and we looked at young women, and I said, where do you think they are in terms of power? We'd say, well, they're probably pretty low, because they're women, and they're young women, they're unmarried women, low. So now we have something kind of interesting. Indeed, I think more than kind of interesting. We have a powerful group, married men, and a not powerful group, young single women, cooperating together to oppress some group of women we have not yet identified. That's interesting, because we often think about oppression as working like one group does it to another group. But here we have 2 groups in very different power positions, married men, young women, cooperating together. Well, that's weird. To oppress a third group. Interesting. Now you can see why we're having this lecture, because if this is just this slide, look, married men accused women of being witches. Yeah, that sucks, but I don't get out of bed for that stuff. Oh, look, in the past, men were mean to women. Really? Oh, thanks, Peg. Thank God we have college. Okay, so not that. This other thing. The powerful group, the not powerful group, that's interesting. Good. Well, it's interesting to me. You're going to have to play along. Here's another one. This is a tiny bit complicated. I always mean to rework the wording on this slide so we understand it better, but I don't. because every time I rework it, it doesn't get any better. It's just a tiny bit complicated. So Carol Carlson was trying to figure out how it was that some women ended up being accused of witchcraft, and how it was some women ended up executed and some women did not. And she plugged in a ton of things. Were they married? Nope. Was it that they were rich or poor? Nope. Was it where they lived? Nope. Until she came along this, which were the women, these female witches, again, remembering they're not actually witches, but these women who had been accused of being witches, did they have brothers and sons or not? So a woman with brothers or sons is a woman who has heirs. So if I have brothers or sons, when my husband or dad dies, my brothers or sons will inherit the stuff, not me. Okay? But if I do not have heirs, see that column with no heirs? If I do not have heirs, there are no brothers or sons, then when my dad dies or my husband dies, I inherit the stuff. You see that? So women with no heirs means no male heirs, means women who are going to inherit. And women with male heirs are women who are not going to inherit. And if we look at that witches with no heirs column, you can see that women with no heirs who stood to inherit property, usually a farm, but not always, were 61% more likely to be accused of witchcraft, 64% more likely to be tried for witchcraft, 76 times more. So 3/4 of convicted women were women who were going to inherit property. And oh my God, look at the executed line. 90%, 9 out of 10 dead witches were women who had inherited or were going to inherit property. Oh, that's super interesting. So if we went back to that slide about how some women were executed and some were not, we could look and find out, and indeed she did, and we could find out that the women who were allowed to live fell in that with heirs category. That is, they were women who had male heirs who weren't going to inherit anything. But women who were going to inherit things were way more likely to be accused of witchcraft, way more likely to go through the process, found guilty, and be executed. And then let me ask you this. So say I'm a witch, I have no brothers or sons, I inherit my husband's farm. It's mine. I got no brothers or sons. My community accuses me of witchcraft, finds me guilty, and executes me. What happens to my farm? You got it? Yeah. The state gets it, or the government gets it. But remember, this is a theocracy where the church is the government, and the church elders are the ones deciding whether or not I'm guilty. So the church elders, knowing I am the sole, there's no heirs for my farm, execute me, and then the church, headed up by the church elders, gets the farm. Oh, that's super interesting. Huh. So now we're not talking just about religious dysfunction, or at least we're talking about sort of maybe a classic religious dysfunction, which is religion used to enrich some people and to control people, right? So you get rid of some troublesome woman and you get her stuff. That's a win-win. We take these women who are potential inheritors, or maybe they already have inherited. They've got a little bit of community power because so remember, if they're inheritors and their husband or father is dead, now they are femme sole. They own a farm. They have a little bit of power. What does the church do? They say, oh, you must be a witch. And they execute them. You get rid of the powerful woman and you score her property. Yay! Boo. Okay, one more slide. Last one is the only one without the sort of the witchcraft. Instead, you have over there, look at the column under time period. It says there's the 1630s and 40s, the 1650s and 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 1690s. So we have here the colony going from being the 1630s to being set. We have the colony covering a century of time, right? So the colony chronologically maturing. And it turns out when men wrote their wills, there were two ways they could write their wills. They could leave their wife ownership of the farm. I'm a man, I own a farm, I'm writing my will. I could say, when I die, my wife gets the farm. When she dies, we'll give it to my sons. Or you could say, my wife gets use value. That is, I'm going to leave my farm to my son, but my wife gets to live on the farm until she dies. And if you're thinking, well, there's really no difference, there is. Owning things gives you power. So there in the 1630s and 40s, in the very beginning years of the colony, men were about 50% as likely, about half of men respected their wives enough to leave their wives their property. And the other half of men were like, no, I'm gonna pass her up because she's just a woman and give the stuff to my son. And what happens as you go down that thing is you find out that you go from about half of men leaving wives their property to jump down to the bottom of that ownership column where it says 25%. About only a quarter of men respecting their wives enough to leave them property. So what that chart tells us is that women in Puritan society were losing power over time. And I like that chart because it tells us something opposite from the way we understand American history. That is, we understand American history generally to be every decade we get better. Everybody gets more power. Every decade things get better for women, brown people, everybody. And it turns out, and you probably know this, it turns out not to be true. And indeed, what we see here with this chart very clearly is that over time, women in Puritan society are losing power. Okay? So it's true that if things are getting better in Puritan society, and they may very well be, they're getting better for somebody, but not for women. Who are they getting better for? You're right, men. So yeah, depends on who you ask the question about. You can also guess outside of this whole thing that things are not getting better for the indigenous people and that things are not getting better for the people they import from Africa. So the only group of people things are getting better for in this society is men, and particularly property owning men. Okay, so that's a very different thing. So again, the last point we want here is that Puritan women were losing power over time. And here's the other thing we can know about that. If you belong to a group that's losing power, like say Hispanic Americans in the Trump era, if you're in that group, you not only you're in that group, you know that your group is losing power at that moment, and you don't like it. When your group is losing power, you know it, and you don't like it. No group likes to lose power. Easy peasy. So we can also guess that women knew that they were losing power over time. They weren't stupid. They were just as smart as you and me. Okay? All right. So here's our big sum up. I'm gonna read through it briefly, but you feel free to pause it if this is where you need to catch up on your notes, okay? But anyway, first thing, most witches were women. Yeah. Second thing, there were some man witches. They were considered dangerous because they were leaders. Yeah. 3, older women were more vulnerable to witchcraft accusations and executions. And remember I said it's because the society didn't need them as much. 4, possessed accusers were most likely young women, a not powerful Puritan group. 5, non-possessed accusers were likely to be adult men, that is, a powerful Puritan group. Oh, remember how we have the cooperation stuff, right? Least powerful group, most powerful group, cooperating together to possess a third group, oppress a third group. 6, women inheritors were way more likely to be executed. That is, 9 out of 10 dead witches were women inheritors. There's the big one. That's my favorite statistic. And 7, Puritan women were losing power over time. Right? Okay. So, what does that mean? Oh, Peg, I'm exhausted. I'm 41 minutes into this lecture and I'm just exhausted. What does it mean? Peg, why are you telling me this stuff? Okay. Well, before I go on to the last couple of slides, let me tell you this. You may not remember it, but I promised you the first night or the second night that I would never ever lecture you about stuff just for the fun of it. That every lecture would be, I would connect it to something in your life. That there would be a point about how you understand the world you live in. And so is the case with this business about power and witchcraft. And I'm particularly interested in why did women collaborate with men to oppress women? I'm not particularly interested in why did men oppress women. In patriarchy, men oppress women. Not all men. Dudes, don't get defensive and upset. I don't think any of you did it. But men as a group oppress women. That's the nature of patriarchy. Okay? So I don't find that interesting. Upsetting, yes, but not particularly interesting. Where this gets interesting is when women collaborate with us. And in that we can learn some lessons for our life. So before we go on to that, let's sum up what all this previous witchcraft. Spirit and witchcraft cases were moments of patriarchal control of powerful or potentially powerful women, the inheritors, right? And killing women and getting them out of the way is a way of controlling them. Okay, so here's where we get to the nitty-gritty of why you should care about witchcraft cases in colonial America. So something that happened 200, 300, 400 years ago. Yeah. Why, Peg? Why? Well, it has to do with class status anxiety and Stockholm Syndrome. So we're going to talk about these two things now. And I don't have a lot of words there except the two things because there are too many words to say. So class status anxiety is that thing that we all have, whether you know it or not. That is, we have anxiety about our class status. So we all are anxious about where we are in the class ladder. Am I upper middle class? Am I middle class? Am I lower middle class? Am I upper working class? Am I the working poor? Am I rich? We're all anxious about that. But the thing that we're really anxious about is about shifting positions in that class status ladder. And it turns out the thing that really makes us anxious isn't what you'd think. That is, we talk a lot about moving up the class status ladder. That is why I assumed that you were in college, because you want to get some kind of degree so that you can get some kind of better job, so that you can pay more, so that you can buy more shit you don't need. Or, food. Anyway, but it turns out that's not what keeps us up at night. Succeeding in moving up the ladder doesn't make us nearly as anxious as our worries about failing and sliding down the ladder. So class status anxiety is a thing that sociologists and historians both talk about. That it is about this sort of fear of sliding down the ladder. And then it turns out what we do as human beings, and certainly as Americans, is in our anxiety about sliding down the class status ladder, we project that anxiety on the group below us that we fear joining. This explains, for example, why so many poor whites hate poor brown people, because poor whites in a white supremacist society, and that's what we live in, whether you want to admit it or not, the only thing poor whites have to feel superior to with poor blacks or poor Hispanics or poor Asians is at least they're white. But there's all this anxiety about slipping down. Now, poor whites don't wake up and think, "Oh, tomorrow I might be black," but that I might become that I feel anxious about that I may become even a more even despised member of society. Because in a capitalist society, we tend, and it's not fair, we tend to despise people lower on the ladder, which is one of the reasons we fear falling down. There are a lot of reasons. Simple inability to take care of your family or yourself would be probably the biggest reason, right? So class status anxiety is about how we fear moving down the ladder of class status and then project those fears and anxiety, which is closely related to hate, onto the groups below us. So this helps us explain, for example, in way back in the witchcraft cases we were just talking about, why young women were so eager to point the finger at older women. That is, why women were willing to help men oppress other women. Class status anxiety. These young women belonged to a group that was losing power over time. Remember the previous slide? Yeah. They didn't like it. Of course they knew it. Anyone who's in a group that's losing power knows it. It's one of the reasons the conservative right and white supremacist identifying people are so anxious and worked up right now, and so hysterical and so willing to believe the very worst things about the left, because they understand at the base of it, peeps, and this is important to know, they understand they're losing power in America. And this freaks them out. Nobody wants to be in a group that's losing power. Same thing with these young women way back in the witchcraft trials. Also, it explains why women in general are as inclined as men to oppress women. That is, remember the very first lecture I said anyone can be a feminist, men or women. Anyone can be a sexist, men or women. It is not so simple as men are sexist and women are not. Women are feminists. No. Feminists come in both genders. Sexists come in both genders. And I would argue that a female sexist is actually worse than a male sexist. A male sexist, I understand, because there's something in it for you. The female sexist, you're just screwing with your own group. I guess they do it because there is something with it. The thing about class status anxiety is, well, actually we'll get to Stockholm Syndrome, but by identifying with a more powerful group, men, women think they can gain power. So they curry favor with a more powerful group by oppressing other women. Class status anxiety. Do you get that? It is, I'm talking about a whole bunch of things all at once, but sort of essentially fundamentally that thing where groups will hate groups below them. Why is that? Rich whites aren't particularly worked up about black people. And trust me, not for a second is our president either. He does it because there's power in whipping up the people who are anxious about that. That's all. I'm not saying the guy's not a racist, because if you use that stuff to gain your own power, that makes you a racist. But I don't think the current president has any strong feelings about anyone besides himself, because he's got a psychological problem. Nonetheless, Stockholm Syndrome is really interesting. If we were in class, I'd say, okay, who knows this? And a couple of you would raise your hands, and I'd say, okay, somebody explain it. But Stockholm Syndrome was first noticed back in the 60s by some psychologists in Stockholm. There was a bank robbery. The bank robbers took captives, took prisoners, took, what do you call that? Hostages. And very quickly, the hostages, by the end of the day, were negotiating with the police on behalf of the bank robbers who they had sympathy for. These poor bank robbers, they're misunderstood. You should let them go. It's not their fault. That is Stockholm Syndrome. And Stockholm Syndrome is, for example, another way we think about Stockholm Syndrome is battered wife syndrome. That is, women who are abused by their husbands are very likely to also defend their husbands and their husbands' actions. This is probably true really for all spouses, and I recognize that there are in some relationships men who are battered. But I will tell you, I live in a country where we only recently decided to care about abusive spouses when we found out some very small number of men were abused. But we thought it was just women, nobody cared. So I'm still pissed about that. Anyway, so battered wife syndrome is sort of the allying yourself with your abuser. Children do this with their parents, but they have to because children are so dependent. I would argue that wives, in many cases, are dependent too, which is one of the reasons, ladies, you should get your own job, buy your own stuff, buy your own shiny stuff, and be able to take care of yourself. I'm not saying you shouldn't get married. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a spouse, but you shouldn't be dependent. Dependency is dangerous. It relies on the absolute goodness of the person you're depending on. And it turns out there's not a ton of absolutely good people out there. And I don't mean absolutely good men. I mean absolutely good people, because you could be relying on another woman if you're not heterosexual, right? Anyway, so Stockholm Syndrome is about this thing where we don't like powerlessness. So if I'm taken hostage in a bank robbery, I am at that moment powerless. And I don't like that my very human nature rebels against the powerlessness of that. And so what I will do is I will search the area for someone powerful to ally myself with. If I've been taken hostage by guys with guns, then it is the guys with guns with power, and I will ally myself with them so as to lend myself some power to escape the powerlessness which is extremely upsetting to me or to anyone. So class status anxiety is where people with little power are often likely to ally themselves with people with power, in part to make themselves feel more powerful, in part in the hopes that perhaps the powerful will lend them some power. This is generally a false hope, but nonetheless. Stockholm Syndrome then begins to help us understand why, for example, some poor brown people nonetheless describe themselves as Republicans. And if there are any Republicans listening, I do not mean to insult you, though I understand I just did. But the truth is, and you can say what you will, the truth is the Republican Party is not interested in helping poor people or women. So when women or poor people ally themselves with a party that is fundamentally only interested in helping the rich, they're engaged in Stockholm Syndrome. They're engaged in allying themselves with someone who is abusing them and not going to help them, but doing it because it appears like that's where the power is, and that's maybe they will lend me some. This for me, this explains, say, the rallies of the predator in chief. Those aren't powerful people who show up at those and go freaking bug nuts for that guy. So Stockholm Syndrome also helps us understand why women will ally themselves with men against other women, both in the witchcraft cases and in any time in American history, including right now. That is, if the women and men listening to this don't know some woman who hasn't stabbed an individual woman or women in general in the back in some way. My mother, and I love her, is a conservative woman who will not vote for women because she doesn't think they should have power. That is a woman who is stabbing women in the back. She is saying women aren't fully human. That is in part about not really Stockholm, but something like Stockholm Syndrome, where we ally ourselves with a powerful group that does not have our best interests in mind. Whether it's conservative white dudes, if you're a woman, or a brown person, or witchcraft accusers if you're a young woman in Puritan England. It also helps us understand why women in America, and this is something we're talking about race a lot right now, and I think that's cool. I'm a tiny bit frustrated that America is incapable of talking about sexism at the same time, because we're also a really sexist nation. The Karen stuff was a super good proof of that. Yeah, I get there's some privileged white women who are obnoxious, but the ways in which the society was really, really excited, including women, to jump on demonizing women who were, while maybe being dickish, but also like for a while there, if you were assertive and white, you could call the Karen. Like I wasn't allowed to be assertive at all anywhere. And so it was the Karen stuff is a way of keeping women down. It is a thing used by other women to keep women down. That Stockholm Syndrome and class status anxiety help us understand, and the witchcraft cases, why women oppress women, because that's perplexing and depressing. Because the reality is, people, that women make up 51 to 52% of every single population in the world, and we always have, because we are constitutionally stronger than men. So few of us die at birth, and we outlive men. And we don't outlive men because we don't work as hard and we get to take more naps. We are constitutionally stronger. Nature built us that way because we have babies and raise them. So constitutionally stronger. We're not physically stronger. I can't pick up a 50-pound sack of flour, but I can withstand a headache better than my husband can. Man, you have no idea. Anyway, so these are if you're wondering, like, why, Peg, why? Well, with the witchcraft lectures, because it's part of Colonial American, because it's interesting. Why are you still talking about this stuff? Because I think it's super helpful to try and figure out why women remain a second-class population in America, and why we still don't have women in most positions of power. It's not just men. It's women keeping us down too, because we make up a majority. If tomorrow morning all American women stood up and said, it ends today, sexism, sexual abuse, keeping women out of positions of power, it all ends today. It would end today because, ladies, we outnumber the men. Trust me, they know that. But it's not. That's not going to happen. It's never going to happen because we are divided by so many things. There is no group called women that meets on Tuesdays to decide to end sexism, sadly. And we are divided by race, class, gender, sexuality, all that stuff, religion. But we're also divided by issues of class status anxiety and Stockholm Syndrome. And I think that's helpful because if we can't explain why women, even though we're a majority, we're still oppressed, then we're left with only two things. Either one, women really are inferior, and that's why we have a second-class status still today in America, or there's some other really complicated stuff going on to explain it. And I will tell you this for sure. The complicated answer is almost always the correct answer. If someone comes to you with a simple, clear, easy answer to a hard question, why is there racism? Why is there sexism? If the answer is something simple and clear, something that might be offered to you by, say, an orange man at a rally, it's probably the wrong answer. Because complicated issues require complicated answers. And it's why. You have to think. You don't have to go to college, but you have to think to be a real American. It requires you. This is a complicated country with complicated problems, and you have to think. You have to. You have to think. You can't just play with your phone and watch Netflix movies. You have to think. And you have to think for yourself, which is hard. Anyway, I've spoken. Next slide.